Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Reading Together from Harp Press. I'm Eugene Luning, co-founder of Harp, and I'm delighted to invite you again into my study as we read together through C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. I always want to remind you that this is a HarperCollins hardcover of the book. That's their book. But we love Lewis, and we really love the playfulness and sort of the mirth that comes with this wonderful work of sort of inverted theology, looking through the evil side's perspective of all that you and I hold dear. In our last episode, we were in letter 22, which, by the way, humorously, if I'll remind you, ends with Screwtape suddenly turning into a centipede. Well, I'm guessing he must have turned back into his evil, normal self because he gets to write this chapter, not Toadpipe. So we're going to be in letter 23. Let's dive in. My dear Wormwood, through this girl and her disgusting family, the patient is now getting to know more Christians every day, and very intelligent Christians too. For a long time, it will be quite impossible to remove spirituality from his life. Very well then, we must corrupt it. No doubt, you have often practiced transforming yourself into an angel of light as a parade ground exercise. Now is the time to do it in the face of the enemy, meaning God. The world and the flesh have failed us. A third power remains. And success of this third kind is the most glorious of all. A spoiled saint, a Pharisee, an inquisitor, or a magician makes better sport in hell than a mere common tyrant or debauchee. Looking round your patient's new friends, I find that the best point of attack would be the borderline between theology and politics. Several of his new friends are very much alive to the social implications of their religion. That in itself is a bad thing, but good can be made out of it. I've already touched on this probably 3 times in the course of this book, but before I continue to read on where he's going to start to pull apart that borderline, that idea that there's spirituality and politics and that there is a confluence, you can almost picture like a Venn diagram where they cross over one with the other. I want to say to you, this may be some of the most apropos things we can be reading. I'm recording this in August 2023, and I find the political landscape of the last 10 or so years to be the most troubling thing I have ever seen in my lifetime. I am middle-aged, so I can speak with a little bit of authority, having seen a few things. So friends, whatever side of the political spectrum you are on, I just want to begin this chapter by saying, your duty is to Jesus of Nazareth. It is not to a political party. It is most certainly not to any particular personality within a political party. This is the way that history has gone completely awry. Whenever we see these kinds of things happening, where ideology becomes linked to people, individuals, those are the places where we step into the greatest danger of all. That's really how the Roman Republic fell. It's also how the Roman Empire began to fall. It's how, let's say, the French Revolution, which could have begun to spin in maybe a more positive direction, started to fall apart with the personality of someone I'm interested in, but of Napoleon. This is the way that we've gone from believing we're in the midst of progress in the early 20th century to the absolute destruction of World War I and II. Friends, you and I, again, follow Jesus. We follow no man, only the God-man. So I really, really want you, again, no matter which side of the spectrum you fall on, to pay attention to this chapter. Let it burrow its way down into your heart and set you free of maybe some bondages that you aren't even aware have taken hold. Let's keep reading. You will find that a good many Christian political writers think that Christianity began going wrong and departing from the doctrine of its founder at a very early stage. Now, this idea must be used by us to encourage once again the conception of a, quote, historical Jesus, unquote, to be found by clearing away later accretions and perversions, and then to be contrasted with the whole Christian tradition. In the last generation, we promoted the construction of such a historical Jesus on liberal and humanitarian lines. We are now putting forward a new historical Jesus on Marxian, catastrophic, and revolutionary lines. The advantages of these constructions, which we intend to change every 30 years or so, are manifold. If the first place, they all tend to direct men's devotion to something which does not exist, for each historical Jesus is unhistorical. The documents say what they say and cannot be added to. Each new historical Jesus, therefore, has to be got out of them by suppression at one point and exaggeration at another. And by that sort of guessing, brilliant is the adjective we teach humans to apply to it, on which no one would risk 10 shillings in ordinary life, but which is enough to produce a crop of new Napoleons, new Shakespeares, and new Swifts in every publisher's autumn list. In the second place, all such constructions place the importance of their historical Jesus in some peculiar theory he is supposed to have promulgated. He has to be a, quote, great man, unquote, in the modern sense of the word. One standing at the terminus of some centrifugal and unbalanced line of thought, a crank vending a panacea. We thus distract men's minds from who he is and what he did. We first make him solely a teacher, and then conceal the very substantial agreement between his teachings and those of all other great moral teachers. For humans must not be allowed to notice that all great moralists are sent by the enemy, meaning God, not to inform men, but to remind them, to restate the primeval moral platitudes against our continual concealment of them. We make the sophists. He raises up a Socrates to answer them. Our third aim is, by these constructions, to destroy the devotional life. For the real presence of the enemy, otherwise experienced by men in prayer and sacrament, we substitute a merely probable, remote, shadowy, and uncouth figure, one who spoke a strange language and died a long time ago. Such an object cannot, in fact, be worshipped. Instead of the Creator adored by its creature, you soon have merely a leader acclaimed by a partisan, and finally a distinguished character approved by a judicious historian. And fourthly, besides being unhistorical in the Jesus it depicts, religion of this kind is false to history in another sense. No nation and few individuals are really brought into the enemy's camp by the historical study of the biography of Jesus, simply as biography. Indeed, materials for a full biography have been withheld from men. The earliest converts were converted by a single historical fact, the resurrection, and a single theological doctrine, the redemption, operating on a sense of sin which they already had, and sin not against some new fancy dress law produced as a novelty by a great man, but against the old, platitudinous, universal moral law which they had been taught by their nurses and mothers. The Gospels come later and were written not to make Christians, but to edify Christians already made. Now I'm going to stop there and just talk for a moment about what he's talking about. I think oftentimes you and I can get into one of two camps. We can be in that what we would call historical Jesus camp. And this was a movement that you see in like the writings of Schweitzer and a few other individuals in the early 20th century, where they were so fascinated by the texts that were available, not just the Gospels, but from the first, say, 500 years of this millennium, that millennium, to try and piece together, was Jesus actually just an Essene? Or was he a zealot? What can we actually know about him? And then let's burrow deeper and deeper into that. So that's sort of the historical Jesus. We don't tend to do that today in the same way they did. But what I see in the church today is that there's this sort of looking back at Jesus wistfully as a historical figure, like some of these other ones I named, Napoleon, to look at him and study his life and really always to cast our minds back. From there, he can then simply become a teacher, just someone who gave yet another great moral law in his day. Well, what we do when we look back in time is we put his feet in concrete. We essentially say, you stay back over there while I deal in the problems and issues and stresses of my day. Okay, so that's one side, sort of the historical Jesus side that we tend to still do in some ways. The other side is to so theologize, to so look back and then hold as our doctrine, as being the way of life, that when people from the outside look at our church gatherings, they think it's just like mantras, that it's just theologies that we hold dear, and if you're not inside of these, you're outside of them. That's how we sometimes put up walls between ourselves and the world around us. Here's what I think Lewis is trying to tell us through the lips of Screwtape. We are to look back, yes, to the actual historical work of Jesus. We are to read those Gospels, which he talked about, which are meant, yes, for our edification, but also for our instruction. We're to read every single day in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and actually take to heart what was the teaching and the daily work of Jesus in his own life. And we're to emulate it. If we see him acting in such a way, like turning the other cheek, well, that's what he said to do. That's what we see him do. Let's do it. But then, friends, just as Screwtape is writing here, I love this. When we think about the theology upon which Christendom has been built, we're not to cast it off. We're not to always be beginning again and not trusting to the historical record about what's been said and written and thought by people like Augustine. But what are we to do? We're to be converted by a single historical fact, the resurrection. Our hearts are to believe that this is a deathless truth, that Jesus is in fact alive. And we are to be converted according to a single theological doctrine, the redemption. This idea that I often say to my friends, that you and I, we're the freest people we've ever met. So we must live free, live the freedom of Jesus that has been bought in his blood. So much of our theology becomes after that, sadly, something like Pharisaism. It's all kinds of little minors that we turn into majors. It's little bits of contention that we've turned into denominations. Friends, you and I follow, yes, a historical Jesus. But here's the fact that's most important about him. He's contemporaneous. He's alive. If I stop right now and talk to him, I'm talking to him. I'm not talking to a nebulous Godhead that I would never know. It's the Jesus of history who has never ceased to live. And if I live out of a deathless and fearless space of complete freedom by his blood, well, what kind of person in Jesus do I become, or you become? People filled with love. People who are overbrimming with his kindness toward others. Because the great calling card we see right from the end of Acts chapter 2 is people who are so lovely with love that the whole world gets drawn in and at least interested. They were greatly respected by Jerusalem in their day because they showed by their love that Jesus must still be alive because their fellowship still looked like him, smelled like him. So as I began by talking about, hey, we need to pay attention in these sort of political ways, I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, Screwtape's going to continue to talk more about that in the next episode, the next chapter. But I want to remind you, our business is with people and with showing them the love of Jesus. That's what we're trying to do. Well, now we get to the long last paragraph of this chapter. Let me keep going. The historical Jesus, then, however dangerous he may seem to be to us at some particular point, is always to be encouraged. About the general connection between Christianity and politics, our position is more delicate. Certainly, we do not want men to allow their Christianity to flow over into their political life, for the establishment of anything like a really just society would be a major disaster. On the other hand, we do want, and want very much, to make men treat Christianity as a means. preferably, of course, as a means to their own advancement. But, failing that, as a means to anything, even to social justice. The thing to do is to get a man at first to value social justice as a thing which the enemy demands, and then work him on to the stage at which he values Christianity because it may produce social justice. For the enemy, God, will not be used as a convenience. Men or nations who think they can revive the faith in order to make a good society might just as well think they can use the stairs of heaven as a shortcut to the nearest chemist's shop. Fortunately, it is quite easy to coax humans round this little corner. Only today, I have found a passage in a Christian writer where he recommends his own version of Christianity on the ground that, quote, only such a faith can outlast the death of old cultures and the birth of new civilizations, unquote. You see the little rift? Believe this, not because it is true, but for some other reason. That's the game. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Last week, my wife and I had a getaway, and we stayed at a beautiful hotel not terribly far from our house. And there was some kind of a political conference going on. And so that morning of our stay, we went to the gym, and I noticed a lot of people kept coming over to a particular gentleman who was working out in the gym about 10 feet away from me, and they were sort of talking to him in this good-natured, but sort of, let's say, kissing up sort of way. Eventually, about the fifth person that walked over and was chatting him up said, well, Senator, and I realized, oh, that's a U.S. Senator. I probably should have noticed that. Well, a few minutes later, we went and got ready, and then we went to a lovely breakfast. And we were sitting in this big dining room. And I looked around, and there was actually one of the current presidential candidates sitting one table away. Over by that corner was a congressman. 2 tables back of us was another senator. I realized, oh, there must be a political conference going on. But I was so aware, as I sat there having a great conversation with my lovely wife, of all the people who continually walked over and with that same sort of wheedling tone tried to have a little word with each of these people, tried to have an experience of the power that they perceive to be upon these people because we have elevated them to a national stature. Friends, I just want to say again, you and I, we are finite beings in these fleshly selves. We have been given an infinite opportunity to follow the contemporaneous, again, way of Jesus. I always remind my friends, it's great to get out there and vote. It's great to engage with our system of democracy, which is a beautiful system, written up and thought up by some very, very brilliant men and women. But I also, again, want to say as we close out this episode, and I think we'll delve back into this in future chapters, I want to remind you that as a follower of Jesus, you vote, you support, that's fine, but you do not get down into the trenches of this sort of warfare that is raging around us right now. All of that has nothing to do with the way of Jesus. That's all about people groups and blocks who are pitting themselves against one another. I almost see it like World War I. We get entrenched. We throw these missiles at each other, and it's ugly. It's not like Jesus. So you as an individual, what is your call? It's to love every other individual you can. It's to spread this kingdom person to person as far as you can before you go home to be with him. Let's not let the politics of the hour talk to us, to dictate to us, to change our inner lives. Friends, we're better than that. We follow one who is certainly far, far better than that. So let's go against the grain this day. Again, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, let's go against the grain of the hatefulness, of the us versus them, and let's meet every individual we do, no matter what their political persuasion, in a way that absolutely arrests them with love. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for bearing with me if you don't entirely agree with some of the ways that I'm speaking. I'm delighted to read together with you in C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. I look forward to our next episode and to some thoughtful pondering before the Lord about what it means to really follow him in these day-by days of our human life. Again, I'm grateful for each of you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.